I want to, as Christine said, I just want to do a quick review because I want to make this like building blocks. And I want to begin with something that Christine said, and I'll repeat it. And I don't mean it as an indictment, so don't take it that way. But it's very common for people to have favorite verses, and basically to have a few dozen, 5 or 6 or 2 or 3 favorite verses to go to. And I get that. But if we can understand the narrative within which those verses appear, then those verses actually make sense theologically. So instead of, and here's the important part, instead of starting from those verses and using them as your foundation, what we're trying to do is establish the foundation for the verses so you understand why they're there and how it all makes sense. And then you can move from those verses and others to the world today. So what I'm trying to do, and I'll keep doing it, is I'm starting, I hear this thing among some Christians about, the narrative of Scripture, and they kind of mean creation, fall, redemption, that kind of idea, which kind of works at a systematic level, but I'm actually taking you to a narrative, the real narrative, not just the theological narrative or something. I actually want to take you through the narrative itself. And so that's why we're beginning in Genesis. And so we'll work our way through, like tonight we'll begin to move into the law. And the law makes sense based on what you see in Genesis. And in the law, which we'll do next time, you find a bunch of laws, which are unique in the ancient world, dealing with social issues. But what we'll see tonight lays the foundation for that, and it explains why those laws are there and why God will deal with them in a certain kind of way. But we'll get to that in time. So we begin with the image of God, and this is a common place to begin. Genesis chapter 1 and 2, actually, about humans being the unique creation of God, giving them infinite worth, but also infinite potential. We talked about this, about ruling and subduing the earth in chapter 1, 26 to 28. And we actually see this beginning to happen in Genesis chapter 2, where they begin to work the land. And what God is inviting them to do is to join him in his work in creation. It says he rested after he had finished on the seventh day. But the very fact that he tells them to rule and subdue the earth before he rests is telling you that he is resting, but that doesn't mean his work is finished. That what now he's doing is he's allowing humans to take on the task of joining him in his work of ruling, which is what he is. He's the king. But ruling and subduing, putting order into the chaos, which he began to do, but under his leadership, and reflecting the same kind of heart and fountain of life kind of view of rulership, which gets distorted in chapter 3 with the aspiration to be like God. And once humans take on that aspiration, we begin to rule by eliminating, segregating, oppressing, killing, and taking control in forceful ways. And this is the story of human history. We dehumanize and we minimize others. I mean, a classic example, if you think of what's going on in Ukraine theologically, where the Russians have defined Ukrainians as subhuman, this is theologically, it's not a surprise. This is what humans have been saying about other humans, whether it was in this country with the African Americans in particular, but you also see it in race issues around the world. This is how humans will justify taking control of territory, which is what you're seeing in Ukraine, of political systems by dehumanizing the other. So it's a perversion of the invitation that God had given. Now, what we looked at when we got to this idea of the fall, was that when humans begin, as I said, to act this out, we do it by killing. And so what you find is the first thing humans will do, they'll kill each other. Cain kills Abel. Chapter 4, Lamech is boasting about how many people he can kill. And Cain begins to wander, and he's scared of being killed himself. You have the entrance of death. You have chapter 5, where everyone is dying. You have that litany of, and he died, and he died, and he died. And then you get to the flood, and everybody dies. And so when God had said, when you take of the fruit that's in the middle of the garden, when you begin to act out in ways that you're told not to do, it will bring death. And in chapter 2, when he says this, we don't know. If you have to pretend you don't know the rest of the story. And so when you ask yourself in chapter 2, well, how will death come? Well, let the narrative tell you. And it comes by people killing each other, people dying of old age and disease, chapter 5, or God taking our life. And so this is the story. And what you begin to see is when you get to chapter 11 is the building of the Tower of Babel. And now all of humanity is gathered to shake their fist against God and reach to the heavens. And this will be why God will scatter them. But what you're seeing is this aspiration to play God acts itself out individually, but also corporately. And what I mentioned back then, a couple of months ago, is that when God disperses chapter 11 of Genesis, that explains chapter 10, where everyone is divided according to their clans and their languages. And so chapter 11 tells you how that happened. But here's the point. All the nations of the world are born at Babel. And when you get to the book of Revelation, you have the nations coming together one last time, and you have the final Babylon in the book of Revelation. So what you find in the scope of Scripture is that the history of the nations of the world begin at Babel, and they will end at Babel. And Babel will characterize the nations and the history of the world. The arrogance, the aspiration to be in control, and the violence go with it. So theologically, we should not be surprised at anything we're watching, because this is how humanity has played its history out. So in this context of death, and I liked what Christine said about Christmas and Epiphany, about light. What we're seeing when you read those first 11 chapters of Genesis is you begin to see that we live in a world of death of every kind. And we have friends that are dying of cancer. I heard from a good friend just a day before yesterday, she's now in hospice. All these things are happening. And we live in a world of death. And in this world of death, then, the question is, what will God do? And this is where you find in the book of Genesis some individuals like Seth, or like Enoch, or like Noah, who was going to give the world rest in 529. But the last thing we see about Noah is he's lying drunk and passed out in his tent. But what he does in chapter 12, and this is going to be important for the rest of the biblical story, is that he will not choose a nation of the world. He cannot, because all the nations are born at Babel. He will choose an individual, and he will create a nation that's unique. And this unique nation then becomes the channel to reach the rest of the world. Now, if chapter 1 says God blesses creation, blesses the animals, for instance, in chapter 1, verse 22, he blesses humanity, it should not be a surprise then that the mission he gives the people he will create is that they be a blessing to the world, that they be a blessing to the very nations that reject him. So this is why you put 11 next to 12, because the nations that are born at Babel, it's the same Hebrew word actually in chapter 10 that you find in chapter 12. Those very nations are the nations that we are called to bless, those that have rejected him. And as Herb was saying, this is why he actually did well in the quiz today, is that we should expect, and it tells you this, we should expect rejection, where the world, chapter 12, verse 3, It says, bless those who bless you. I will bless those who bless you. God says that. He says, I will curse those who diminish you. They're different Hebrew words in verse 3. And your English translations usually don't make that distinction, but there actually are two different words. And so the idea is that we should expect to be diminished or to be rejected or kind of thrown aside. Menospreciar, in Spanish, the word. This is what you're seeing. So we should expect this. But at the same time, even as we are being rejected and pushed aside, these are the very nations that we are called to bless. And what you find in the rest of the Genesis narrative is trying to live out the mission. And it's good, and it's bad, and it is terrible. Sometimes they do really great. They build altars, they call on the name of the Lord. He believes the Lord, chapter 15, verse 6, and it was counted to him as righteousness. You have Isaac and Abraham and, the sacrifice idea, and he gets commended for his faith. All that is good, but then you have, them killing. Out of vengeance, you have them lying, you have them cheating, you have them doing all kinds of things that people do. So as the lesson there is, as we live out the mission of God, we live it out as sinful people. Now, what you find in the book of Genesis is that you have these, which is actually makes me feel better, because they're not perfect, and none of us are. We're all sinners. And so what you see is that Abram, who becomes Abraham, and his descendants are beginning to live into the mission of being a blessing, both in faithfulness and failure. But what you find also is their testimony, where they will do these things in the name of Yahweh. And a wonderful verse for that is found in chapter 26, where Abimelech will say, oh, and we see that you are blessed by Yahweh. So as they testify verbally in their public altars, that would have been outside. And so, people would have seen, the worship of Yahweh and God. So what you're finding is testimony as well as lived witness. But again, this is where Herb mentioned something that was good, is that what you're finding is that they're hungry. There's famine, issues of children, barrenness. You see different contexts of war. And so not only are you seeing real life flesh and blood people doing well and not doing well, not only do you see them testifying in word and deed, if I can use that combination, but what you're seeing is they're doing this in the very cauldron of life. And again, see, you're not cherry picking verses. What you're seeing is actually stories of the people of God trying to live out the mission in all the horrors of their life, in all the difficulties of their life. So that's kind of a review of where we've been. I want to set up tonight what we're going to go into in more depth next time, because we've moved from Genesis and now we're going to move into Exodus and the giving of the law. And evangelicals misunderstand Old Testament law big time. And I want to explain how that works. But if we can understand what law is and how law in any country in the world works, it'll help set us up for understanding why the law is the way it is. Next time, and we'll look at particular things, especially what the law says about poverty and foreigners. Now, the first thing is that law is a cultural and sociological reality in a general sense. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what law in any country in the world, and so when I've do a lot of speaking on immigration, and so sometimes what I'll hear is, oh, we're a country of law. Okay, in my mind, I'm going, well, so is every country in the history of the world. I mean, you haven't said anything. We have ancient law codes that are thousands of years old. So even ancient Egypt and the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations had law. So the fact that we say, oh, we're a country of laws, well, you haven't told me anything. Now, what you find is the bigger question is, what is law for? If everyone has it, what is it for? Now, what you find then is that law begins to organize and structure societies. So this is why you'll have laws, even in the ancient world and in Old Testament law. What do you do with property? How do you do marriage? What about inheritance? What about theft? What about murder? What about rape? What about embezzlement? All these things are in Old Testament law. How do you structure your government? You see, all these things are the questions that all law codes will deal with. They're organizing a certain kind of culture. Now, Christine and I, spend a lot of our lives in another culture with a different law. And if you've ever lived in Latin America has law. They do. But the law is different, and so the societies function differently. Let me give you an example. And Christine, this might bring back some memories or nightmares, I'm not sure. But in Guatemala, you are guilty until proven innocent. Okay? That just flips the US model on its head. So when you have a car wreck and the policeman comes, they will impound both cars until they can figure out who is innocent. And so what do you do when the policeman comes? Well, you encourage them to leave because you don't want them to take your car. Even if you're the innocent party, you don't want them to impound your car. So you encourage the policeman to leave. Now, does that function? Yeah, it's been functioning now for quite a long time. Does everybody like it? No, but you just assume that all policemen are corrupt. Now, here's the key point that'll set up what we're going to see in the biblical law, is that the law not only organizes a society, it generates a certain set of values. It generates a cultural ethos. Okay. Now, it becomes self-generating because if it generates a certain kind of set of attitudes, then those attitudes will perpetuate the legal system. And an easy one to look at it, and Herb, this is maybe strike home for you. Segregation, for instance, generated a set of values. It generated a certain view of the world and of a certain view of African Americans. Enshrined in law, it generated an ethos and a certain kind of society. At the same time, the fact that people were enculturated into this perpetuated it. See? So that's why it was so important that you get the civil rights pieces going, which was about legal framework. But it also explains why even changing the laws didn't change the ethos, because that had been generated and perpetuated and inculcated, for generations. And now that the law has shifted, and we're still fighting over certain parts of that law, like voting rights and things like this, the very fact that the law has shifted, if you have a sociological point of view, this will take probably generations, till it really works its way into the ethos of the society, which we're seeing it is, but it's not complete. And sociologically, we shouldn't be surprised. Now, this is why you can begin to understand the Old Testament, that the Old Testament law is unique in the ancient world in many ways. But what it also means then, if you understand this, is that it is there to organize a different kind of society with a different kind of ethos and a different set of values. Now, why isn't this working? Just a second. No, there we go. Now, what is the context for the law in the biblical narrative? Well, it's the Exodus. And what they do is they leave Egypt. Egypt has its laws. Egypt has a society which looks at the worker class, the Israelites, in a certain kind of way. It gives them a certain set of value. What are these people actually worth? And what are they here for? This society with its laws is undergirded by a religion, the Egyptian faith, which is celebrated in its public rituals. And every country that has a religion does this. So it is impregnated into the people in the law codes of the country. It is celebrated and legitimated and sanctified by the religion of that country. And when finally the Exodus happens, what you have is a series of plagues, which actually is a war of the gods. It's a war between the gods and the society which they legitimize, and the God of Israel. Okay? When Israel will establish its law, it is a law that is established in contrast to what they came from and different from where they are going. So it is actually a wonderful narrative truth that God pulls them out of this one legal, cultural world, takes them to the middle of nowhere in a desert, gives them a blueprint for a different kind of society, and then sends them on. Okay? Now, the evangelical misunderstanding about the law in most circles is that the law was given to take care of sin. And so you have all these sacrifices for different kinds of sins. Well, that's true in part, but it doesn't explain the marital laws. It doesn't explain the property laws. It doesn't explain all the civil laws about theft and murder and rape. And it doesn't explain that. It doesn't explain about why you're supposed to take care of your animals. It doesn't explain how, about raising your kids. All these things, what you're supposed to dress and what you're supposed to eat, all that's in the law, you see. The fact that they were supposed to dress differently and have a different kind of diet, all of these are cultural markers. And, if you've traveled around and, or if you have, immigrant friends or friends from another country, and Christine, you can appreciate this, what do they want to talk about? They want to talk about their food, right? So when you go to Guatemala, first thing you want is, black beans or, a Guatemalan, enchilada or something. Rellenitos, all because the food tells you, I'm back in Guatemala, you see. Or if you go to a home that's a home of foreigners, they want to share some of themselves, and the way they do it is with their food, and they'll tell you, how they make it and where it comes from and all this kind of stuff, because it makes them who they are. So you can see where the dietary laws of the Old Testament make cultural sense. And they're part of this larger construction of a unique culture. Now, what happens is this. We cannot replicate Old Testament law. I mean, that'd be kind of silly. I mean, this law was put into place primarily for an agrarian culture thousands of years ago. Why would we want to imitate Old Testament law? See, it doesn't make any sense. and we're not Israelites. But, and I'll show you a verse in just a little bit, if we understand that these laws reflect certain values that are fundamental to God, then what these laws are projecting is what endures. The contextual trappings, like diet, that doesn't apply to us. See? The question then becomes, well, how do Christians act and live in ways that mark us as different? In ancient Israel, part of that would have been their diet. Not so much today. So again, if you understand they are leaving an oppressive system of law and an oppressive culture, and understand the law is a response and an alternative to that, then you should expect the law of God to be liberating. See? And instead of going to the law, like I do work in immigration, and okay, I can give you verses about how to treat immigrants. Okay. But if you understand that how to treat immigrants is part of a larger picture of the kind of people God was trying to create, then you can see that even when you're talking about how the church should handle, immigrants, you're talking about the bigger picture of what does it mean to be the people of God today? This is just a particular dimension of it that everyone should have, and not just immigration advocates. You see? It's part of a bigger ethos. And that's how the ethics of the Old Testament works. Okay? It makes sense because it's an alternative society with an alternative law code, therefore an alternative lifestyle and culture. And you can see how this would play itself out for Christians today. Okay. I mentioned this set of verses yesterday. This was important for especially those working in compassion ministries. What triggers the action of God in Exodus 2 is their crying out. Now, what this is telling you is that a fundamental motivation for the law of God, the law meaning Old Testament law, is God's compassion, and that the law is at some level a response to an oppressed people, and that the God of law, I'm talking about Old Testament law, the God of the law is the God of justice and compassion, and the law now will enshrine those legislatively. Okay, that's important. Again, if you understand this, then you're not cherry picking, let me find some verses about immigrants. What you're seeing is this is part of the DNA of the law itself. Okay, so again, this should define all of us as believers. Oops. Another thing in Exodus 19, you see I'm kind of going there entirely. In Exodus 19, I won't read it just because of time, but in Exodus 19, it talks about how God brought them out to make them his people, but it is based on, let me get there first. It's based on the Exodus. See, and that they are chosen to be a special people, and this special people will be defined in the chapter, beginning in chapter 20, will be defined by their legislation. Okay, so this is the idea that it is a liberated people. This is post-Exodus. You don't fulfill the law to gain salvation. You don't fulfill the law to gain redemption. See, that's not the Old Testament pattern. Evangelicals have this idea that, the Jews all wanted to fulfill the law so they could be saved. That's not how it works. what you're seeing is they are a liberated people, Exodus 19. And God says you're liberated as a chosen people and as a kingdom of priests. So their holiness will be how they live it out legislatively and therefore as a culture. So the important lesson, if Exodus 2 is the idea that compassion and justice or motivates or triggers the heart of God on this, so it's part of the DNA of the law. The second point is that another part of the law is that it is for a redeemed people. It is the expected community of a people who've been redeemed. Okay. Again, you can see how this flows into the church. See? This idea of justice and compassion is expected of a kingdom of priests. In fact, these verses are picked up in 1 Peter. Okay, so you can see how that you can just follow that pattern and it ripples into the New Testament. This verse is important, or these verses are important in Deuteronomy 4, because in Deuteronomy 4, 8 to 10, it says, the nations around you will look at you and say, oh, what a wise God who has given them these laws. Now, what you're seeing is, the idea is not that they mimic or imitate Israelite law, but the law itself, because it's the laws that they find attractive, points them to the God. Oh, what a wise God you have. What a wise people you are. So what you're seeing is the ethos created by Old Testament law itself was to be a testimony to the world. And again, you can see how this bleeds into the New Testament. See? And then these verses, Exodus 6, 4 to 9, and you know this verses talks about teaching your children, and putting it on your doorpost and telling them, and when they, you get up and you lie down and you walk around. I think you've seen those verses, and they usually get used for, family conferences and stuff, which is fine. But what you're seeing is the idea to inculcate it in your children. So it's the idea of a creation of a culture in which everyone is being socialized into this different kind of world, even the children. And then it talks about, well, when your children ask you, so why do we do this? And then you tell them the story. And then in chapter 31, you have the idea of everyone gathering periodically, and this is interesting. It lists all the different people, and it says even the foreigner is to come and listen to the reading of the law. So what you're finding is the idea that everyone, even the foreigner, becomes acquainted with the law. Not only that they would, do the quote unquote right thing, but as you do the right thing, you're also absorbing a certain kind of culture. You're absorbing a set of values, and you're learning about God himself. This is what the Old Testament law is trying to do. This is how they will bless the world, by being a different kind of people. Now, this again takes you beyond individualistic or specific compassion ministries, because what it's saying is that the whole people of God should have these attitudes and values, and as the whole people of God do these things in the Old Testament through its legislation and culture, as we do this through our initiatives and programs, ultimately what it does, it points people to God himself. And so what you find is, and we'll talk about this more next time, a whole set of feasts which are about remembering periodic things. This is what, Christine was talking about the liturgical calendar at the beginning. Part of what the liturgical calendar is trying to do is to give the people of God a different rhythm to their life. Our rhythm in this country is the Super Bowl and Black Friday and, things like this, 4th of July, and that establishes a certain rhythm. But what you're seeing is that this, ancient Israel, as the other cultures around them, had this liturgical calendar, which all these ancient societies did, okay, particular to their God. But it's a rhythm of life. It's a culture that goes along with this rhythm. And you start with the children. See? And ultimately, as you've created this culture, it points the people of God to God, as well as the surrounding people. And basically, what the Old Testament law will tell them is this: if you do not do these things, and if you don't hold those values, you do not know God. You just don't. Because if this is supposed to reflect God, and God established this, and if you don't do it, that means you don't know God. And you can see how that could work into the church as well. If you're not committed to these things, it says something very fundamental about your faith. So next time, what I want to do with this foundation is move into a discussion of certain laws dealing with especially poverty and the foreigner, and show how it's related to the feasts of Israel, as well as standalone legislation. Some of these are actually connected to the rituals, to the liturgies. And again, you can just see how that can work itself out. You see, where the liturgies are designed to be formative and not just celebratory, but actually the liturgies of the people of God are to be formative, which also will change discussions oftentimes in churches.